Picture this for a moment. You've just finished another grueling day at the office. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead as you gather your papers, the cleaning crew already starting their rounds on the floors below. You check your watch and realize with a sinking feeling that you've done it again, stayed too late, pushed too hard, and now you're racing against time to catch the last train home. The same routine you've fallen into countless times before, except tonight something will be different. Tonight, missing that train will lead you somewhere you never expected to go. This story takes place in the heart of Tokyo, in those quiet hours when the city's endless energy finally begins to slow. It's about a man named Kenji Morita, a 32-year-old office worker who thought he knew every corner of his neighborhood, every shortcut through the maze of narrow streets that make up this sprawling metropolis. But as you'll discover, even in a city where millions of people live their entire lives, there are still places that exist just beyond the edge of the familiar world, places that only reveal themselves to those who find themselves truly alone. What makes this story particularly unsettling isn't the presence of obvious supernatural elements, but rather how ordinary everything seems at first, how a simple missed connection can spiral into something far more sinister. This isn't a tale of monsters or demons, but something more subtle and perhaps more terrifying. It's about the spaces between the known and unknown, and what happens when you accidentally step from one into the other. The details I'm about to share with you come from various sources, pieced together from missing person reports, witness accounts, and the testimony of those few individuals who claim to have encountered similar establishments throughout Tokyo's labyrinthine neighborhoods. Whether you choose to believe what happened to Kenji is real, or simply an urban legend passed down through late-night conversations, I'll leave that up to you. But I will say this. After tonight, you might find yourself paying closer attention to those narrow alleys you pass by without thinking, and wondering what lies behind the warm glow of unfamiliar storefronts. Let me take you back to that Tuesday evening in March when Kenji Morita's ordinary life took an extraordinary turn. The Marunouchi building where he worked was nearly empty, with only the security guards and cleaning staff remaining on the lower floors. Kenji sat at his desk on the 15th floor, surrounded by the detritus of another long day. Financial reports scattered across his workspace, empty coffee cups, and the persistent glow of his computer screen displaying spreadsheets that seemed to multiply rather than diminish as the hours wore on. He'd been working at this mid-sized financial firm for almost 6 years now, and the pattern had become depressingly familiar. Start early, stay late, sacrifice personal time for the promise of advancement that seemed perpetually just out of reach. His colleagues had long since departed, their desks dark and abandoned, leaving only the hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of traffic from the street below to keep him company. Kenji glanced at his watch and felt his stomach drop. 11:38. The last train from Shinjuku Station departed at 11:55, and it would take him at least 12 minutes to navigate the underground passages and reach the platform. He'd cut it close before, but tonight felt different. Tonight he was pushing his luck. He saved his work hastily, grabbed his jacket and briefcase, and rushed toward the elevators. The building felt eerily quiet as he descended, the fluorescent lights in the lobby casting everything in stark, clinical white. The security guard nodded as he hurried past, probably accustomed to seeing stragglers like him racing against the clock of Tokyo's unforgiving train schedule. The streets outside were transitioning into their late-night personality. The crowds of salarymen and office workers had thinned considerably, replaced by the occasional taxi and the soft glow of convenience stores that never seemed to sleep. Vending machines hummed quietly on nearly every corner, their bright displays offering everything from hot coffee to cold beer to anyone willing to feed them coins. Kenji's footsteps echoed against the concrete as he navigated the familiar route toward the station. The air carried that particular scent of Tokyo at night, a mixture of exhaust fumes, cooking food from late-night restaurants, and something indefinably urban that he'd grown to associate with home. Street lamps cast long shadows between buildings, creating pockets of darkness that seemed deeper than they should have been. As he descended into Shinjuku Station, The familiar sounds of the underground transportation system enveloped him. Electronic announcements echoing through tiled corridors, the distant rumble of trains arriving and departing, the shuffle of late-night commuters making their way to various platforms. But something felt off about the usual symphony of sounds. There were fewer people than normal, and their voices seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound differently tonight. Kenji's heart pounded as he reached the final escalator leading down to his platform. He could hear the distinctive chime that preceded train announcements, followed by the mechanical voice informing passengers that the 11:55 service to his line was now approaching. He broke into a run, his briefcase bumping against his leg, his breath coming in short gasps as he pushed through the last few passengers blocking his path. The platform stretched out before him, longer than it seemed during normal hours, with only a handful of people scattered along its length. The yellow safety line glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and beyond it, the dark tunnel mouth waited like an open throat. He could see the light of the approaching train growing brighter, hear the increasing volume of wheels against rails as it drew closer to the station. But as Kenji rounded the final corner and sprinted toward the platform, he realized with crushing certainty that he wasn't going to make it. The train was already slowing, its brakes hissing as it prepared to stop. He was still 20 meters away when the doors slid open with their familiar pneumatic sigh, disgorging the last few passengers of the night and taking on the handful of people who had been waiting. He ran harder, his leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor, waving his free hand in a desperate attempt to catch the attention of the train operator. For just a moment, he locked eyes with the conductor through the front window. The man's face was impassive, professional, showing no recognition of Kenji's predicament. The warning chime sounded, that distinctive two-tone melody that signaled the doors were about to close. Kenji reached the platform edge just as the doors sealed shut with a definitive thud. He stood there, breathing heavily, watching as the train began to pull away from the station. The lighted windows slid past him, revealing mostly empty cars with just a few passengers settling in for their journey home. Within seconds, the train had disappeared into the tunnel, leaving behind only the echo of its passage and the lingering scent of ozone from the electrical systems. The platform fell silent around him. The few remaining people had either boarded the train or made their way toward other lines, leaving Kenji alone under the harsh, artificial lighting. He stood at the yellow line, staring into the dark tunnel where his ride home had vanished, feeling the weight of his miscalculation settle over him like a heavy blanket. He pulled out his phone to check for alternative routes, but the results were predictably grim. The next train wouldn't arrive until 5:37 in the morning, nearly 6 hours away. Taxi fare all the way to his apartment would cost him almost a full day's salary, money he couldn't really afford to spend on what amounted to his own poor time management. Kenji made his way back up through the station, past the night. The city, the closing ticket gates and beginning to shut down sections quieter and somehow more sparse of the complex for above ground, felt different now. The security guards who were used without the usual crowds. He could hear his own footsteps more clearly, the distant hum of traffic from the major arteries, and the occasional laughter from late-night establishments that were just beginning to hit their stride. He decided to walk for a while, maybe find an all-night restaurant where he could wait out a few hours before the train started running again. The exercise would do him good, and Tokyo at night had its own particular beauty that he rarely took the time to appreciate. Besides, he was hungry. He'd skipped dinner again, too focused on finishing his reports to think about eating. As he walked away from the bright lights and familiar chaos of Shinjuku, Kenji found himself drawn toward the quieter residential streets that branched off from the main thoroughfares. These narrow lanes held a different character entirely, lined with small businesses, tiny apartments, and the occasional shrine squeezed between modern buildings like memories of an older Tokyo that refused to be completely erased. The vending machines here glowed more softly, their displays reflecting off wet pavement from an earlier rain he hadn't noticed while trapped in his office. The air felt cleaner somehow, less saturated with the exhaust and energy of the major commercial districts. His footsteps echoed differently here, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the slower pace of this forgotten corner of the city. It was then, as he turned down a particularly narrow alley that he was certain he'd never noticed before, that Kenji saw the warm glow spilling out from beneath a traditional Norin curtain. The light was golden and inviting, cutting through the cool blue of the street lamps like a beacon of comfort in the urban night. The warm light drew him closer, cutting through the cool evening air like an invitation he couldn't refuse. As Kenji approached, he could see it was a small sushi bar, the kind of establishment that had somehow survived Tokyo's endless cycle of renovation and demolition. The wooden sign hanging above the entrance was weathered and dark, the characters for Yamada carved deep into its surface and filled with years of accumulated shadow. The Norin curtain swayed gently in front of the entrance, its deep blue fabric moving with a rhythm that seemed independent of any breeze. Through the frosted glass windows, he could see the soft glow of interior lighting and the silhouettes of what appeared to be other late-night diners. The smell that drifted from beneath the curtain was intoxicating. Fresh fish, perfectly seasoned rice, the subtle smokiness of a well-maintained grill, and something else he couldn't quite identify, but that made his empty stomach contract with sudden hunger. Kenji paused at the entrance, suddenly uncertain. This wasn't the kind of place that welcomed walk-in customers, especially not at this hour. These neighborhood establishments usually serve the same regulars for decades, maintaining an invisible barrier between locals and outsiders that could be as impenetrable as any locked door. But his reflection in the glass showed him exactly what he was. A tired salaryman in a wrinkled shirt, carrying a briefcase and wearing the universal expression of someone whose day had stretched far beyond reasonable limits. He lifted the Norin and stepped inside, immediately enveloped by warmth that seemed to seep into his bones. The interior was exactly what he'd expected from the outside. A narrow space with a polished wooden counter running along one wall, 6 stools positioned with precise spacing, and 2 small tables tucked into the remaining floor space. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but carried the patina of age that spoke to years of careful use rather than recent renovation. 3 customers were already seated at the counter, spaced apart in that particularly Japanese way that respected personal boundaries while acknowledging shared space. A middle-aged man in a dark business suit sat nearest the entrance, his attention focused entirely on a bowl of miso soup that steamed gently before him. Next to him, a woman in a beige coat kept her hands folded on the counter, her head tilted downward as if studying something fascinating in the grain of the wood. At the far end, an older man in faded work clothes sat with perfect posture, his back straight and his hands resting motionlessly on his thighs. None of them looked up when Kenji entered. The absence of acknowledgement felt natural rather than rude, simply the quiet courtesy of people who understood that late-night dining was often a solitary affair, even when shared with others. Behind the counter stood the chef, a man in his late 50s with silver hair pulled back under a traditional white headband. His movements were economical and practiced as he worked, every gesture speaking to decades of repetition refined into art. When he noticed Kenji, he looked up with eyes that seemed remarkably alert for this hour of the night. "Welcome," the chef said, his voice carrying the formal Kenji had grown politeness that uphearing in establishments like this. "You missed your train?" The observation was so casual, so perfectly timed, that Kenji found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the question. It could have been a lucky guess. The chef had probably seen countless late-night customers over the years, men and women who found themselves stranded by Tokyo's rigid transportation schedule and seeking refuge in whatever warm spaces remained open. "Yes," Kenji replied, settling onto one of the empty stools. The last one left just as I reached the platform. The chef nodded with understanding and immediately placed a cup of tea before him without being asked. The ceramic was warm against Kenji's palms, and the tea itself was perfect. Not the harsh, bitter brew he'd grown accustomed to from office vending machines, but something delicate and complex that seemed to carry hints of the seasons. As he sipped, Kenji found himself studying his surroundings more carefully. The restaurant felt suspended in time, decorated with the kind of attention to detail that had become increasingly rare in modern Tokyo. Wooden shelves lined the walls, displaying a collection of sake bottles that ranged from familiar commercial brands to hand-labeled varieties that looked like they'd been produced in small batches by rural breweries. A clock on the wall showed 2:17, its hands positioned with the mechanical precision that spoke to regular winding and careful maintenance. The other customers remained perfectly still, each focused on their respective meals with an intensity that bordered on meditation. Their food appeared untouched despite the length of time they'd presumably been sitting there. Steam still rose from their bowls in thin, steady streams, creating small clouds that dissipated just before reaching the ceiling. The sight struck him as oddly beautiful, like some kind of performance art celebrating the aesthetic of anticipation. "What would you recommend?" Kenji asked, studying the menu board mounted behind the chef's workspace. "The omakase is always fresh," came the reply, accompanied by a slight bow. "I select based on what arrived today." Kenji nodded his agreement and watched as the chef began his preparation. Every movement was deliberate and fluid, from the way he selected his knife to the precise angle at which he approached the fish. The blade moved through the pale flesh with surgical precision, creating pieces that seemed to glow under the warm lighting. Rice was shaped with hands that moved so quickly they almost blurred, yet each grain found its perfect position within the overall architecture. The first piece appeared before him within minutes, a creation so visually perfect, it seemed almost criminal to disturb it. The fish was translucent at its edges, deepening to opacity at its center, and the rice beneath it had been shaped with mathematical precision. When he lifted it with his chopsticks, it held together with exactly the right amount of structural integrity. The taste was extraordinary. The fish dissolved on his tongue with a richness that spoke to perfect freshness and ideal temperature, while the rice provided a subtle foundation that enhanced rather than competed. This was sushi as it was meant to be, crafted by someone who understood not just technique, but the deeper principles that transformed simple ingredients into something approaching transcendence. As he ate, Kenji became increasingly aware of the silence that enveloped the restaurant. Not just the absence of conversation, but something deeper and more complete. No sounds filtered in from the street outside, no distant traffic, no footsteps on pavement, no mechanical hums from air conditioning or refrigeration units. Even the soft jazz that might have provided ambient atmosphere in similar establishments was absent, replaced by a quietude so thorough it seemed to have weight. The other customers continued their strange meditation over untouched food. Kenji found himself glancing at them periodically, trying to understand what held their attention so completely. The businessman's soup bowl still produced its steady column of steam, apparently no cooler now than it had been when Kenji first entered. The woman in the beige coat maintained her downward gaze, her hands positioned on the counter as if she were preparing to stand, but had frozen mid-motion. The older worker remained rigidly upright, his breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. Something about their stillness began to trouble him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. It wasn't unusual for people to eat quietly, especially during late-night meals when exhaustion often precluded conversation, but this went beyond quiet. This was an absence of the small unconscious movements that marked living beings. No shifting of weight, no adjustment of posture, no brief glances around the room. They sat like figures in a photograph, captured in a moment that refused to progress. The chef continued his work, preparing each piece of Kenji's meal with the same methodical precision. But as the courses progressed, Kenji noticed that the man's attention seemed divided. While his hands performed their familiar tasks with automatic skill, his gaze kept returning to Kenji with an intensity that felt almost evaluative, as if he were assessing something beyond mere appreciation for the food. "This is exceptional," Kenji said, hoping to break the growing tension with genuine praise. "How long have you been preparing sushi?" "A very long time," the chef replied, his voice carrying an odd echo despite the small size of the room. "Some preparations take longer than others." The response felt like it contained layers of meaning that Kenji couldn't quite decode. He decided to focus on his meal, allowing the extraordinary flavors to distract him from the increasing strangeness of his surroundings. Each piece was a revelation, demonstrating techniques and flavor combinations that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of conventional sushi preparation. But as he ate, he became aware that time itself seemed to be behaving strangely. The clock on the wall still showed 2:17, its hands positioned exactly as they had been when he'd first noticed them. He checked his phone discreetly, holding it below the counter level. 2:17. The numbers remained unchanged even as he watched, as if time had decided to pause its forward progression. The realization should have alarmed him more than it did. Instead, he found himself accepting it as simply another aspect of this unusual establishment, like the perfect temperature of food that never seemed to cool, or the complete absence of sound from the world beyond these walls. Perhaps this was what happened in places like this, neighborhood restaurants so removed from the rushing current of modern life that they existed in their own temporal pocket, governed by rhythms that predated digital clocks and train schedules. The woman in the beige coat suddenly turned her head toward him, the movement so slow and deliberate it seemed choreographed. Her eyes, when they met his, held an expression he couldn't interpret. Not hostility or curiosity, but something closer to recognition, as if she were seeing something in him that he didn't yet recognize in himself. Her lips parted slightly, forming what might have been the beginning of a word, but no sound emerged. After what felt like minutes but could have been seconds, she slowly returned to her original position, leaving Kenji with the unsettling feeling that he'd witnessed what? The chef placed something significant without understanding the final piece of his omakase before him. A creation even more elaborate than the previous offerings. The fish seemed to shimmer with its own internal light, and the rice beneath it had been shaped with such precision it looked almost architectural. As Kenji lifted it to his mouth, he realized that despite having eaten steadily for what felt like an hour, his hunger remained as sharp as when he'd first entered. "Thank you," he said, bowing slightly toward the chef. "I should probably get going now." The chef nodded politely, his expression unchanged, but made no move to present a check or indicate the conclusion of the meal. Kenji looked around for the entrance through which he'd arrived, expecting to see the familiar Norin curtain and the glass door beyond it. The wall where the entrance should have been displayed nothing but a painted scroll depicting a mountain landscape shrouded in mist. Kenji Morita never returned to his apartment that night. His absence wasn't discovered until Thursday morning, when he failed to appear for an important client meeting. His supervisor called his phone repeatedly, each attempt going straight to voicemail. By Friday, a missing person report had been filed with the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. The investigation was thorough, but yielded nothing. Security cameras at Shinjuku Station confirmed that Kenji had indeed missed the last train, just as dozens of other salarymen do every week. But after that, he simply vanished. No taxi records, no convenience store purchases, no trace of his movements through the city's extensive surveillance network. It was as if he had stepped off the platform and disappeared into the urban night. 3 days after his disappearance, a detective canvassing the area spoke with an elderly shop owner who ran a small convenience store near where Kenji was last seen. The old man listened carefully to the description and nodded with something that looked like recognition. "That alley," he said, pointing toward a narrow passage between two buildings. "People ask about it sometimes, especially when someone goes missing. But there's nothing there. Hasn't been for years. The sushi place closed down long ago when old Yamada died alone in his kitchen. Some say he's still there, still preparing meals for customers who can't find their way home. When pressed for details, the shop owner could only shrug. Strange things happen in Tokyo at night. Too many people, too many stories layered on top of each other. Sometimes the past bleeds through, especially for those who are truly lost. The detective examined the alley the next morning and found nothing but shadows between concrete walls. No sign, no entrance, no indication that any establishment had ever operated there. Yet delivery drivers working the late shift continue to report seeing a warm glow emanating from that same narrow space after 2 a.m. They describe the faint sound of chopsticks against ceramic bowls, the whisper of fabric curtains moving in still air, and the lingering scent of perfectly prepared sushi drifting through the darkness. Some say the restaurant only appears to those who have missed more than just their train home, those who have somehow stepped outside the normal flow of time and find themselves wandering streets that exist between the world they knew and places they were never meant to discover. Whether you believe such stories is up to you, but the next time you find yourself alone on Tokyo's quiet side streets in the early morning hours, pay attention to the warm lights that beckon from narrow alleys. And remember that some invitations, no matter how welcome they seem, are meant for those who have already lost their way back to the world they once knew.